Have you ever tried a Vespa, the Fleming recipe Vespa?
I don't drink, so it would have to be a virgin
Oh, right.
Vespa.
I mean, don't bother, but it tastes revolting. And
Right.
it's gin and vodka and a little bit of vermouth. And
Right.
Lou's theory on this is that it's because it never features again in the books, ever again after
Right.
Casino Royale. He drinks vodka martinis, but not this mixed gin and vodka martini. And Lou's theory is that because it's trauma with Vespa and she was a traitor, and it's that. My theory is Fleming had never tasted it when he wrote the recipe, and when he did, he realized it was just revolting.
I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. My special guest today is James Chapman, Professor of Film at the University of Leicester. He has published widely on British popular culture and wartime propaganda. His books include volumes on Doctor Who and James Bond, and his history of the series, Licence to Thrill, is now in its third edition. We've known each other for some 30-odd years, so there is a little reminiscing here and there, but mostly we are focusing on the adaptations of Ian Fleming's first 007 novel, Casino Royale, including its little-known TV version from the 1950s. So get ready for not James Bond, but Jimmy Bond. James, it's taken us a little while to get here, but thanks so much for appearing on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Sergio. It's a pleasure.
Before we start talking about you and your amazing work, I want to ask you the first of my two killer icebreaker questions that are impossible to answer. So the first one is, what would be your definition of film noir?
My understanding of film noir is, I think, fairly common with most commentators. I see it as a historical cycle or movement that originally was specific to American cinema during and immediately after the Second World War, but which has sort of expanded in critical understanding because it's as we know, it's a critical construct rather than an industry category. And so I think our sense of what is noir has extended. It might not even be confined to American cinema anymore. People talk very convincingly about French noir and British noir. And I think it's a term that has developed. We see, in the 1970s, Chinatown, the noir revival, and so on. We see science fiction noir. We see, modern takes on noir. So I think it's a term that has transcended its origins. But for me, originally, it was that period in American cinema between, well, you can never put a precise date on it, but between, some point during the Second World War and a decade or so after the war.
If you could cast your mind right back, what do you think was maybe the first, inverted commas, film noir that you actually ever saw, and when?
Right. So the first one that I saw, this would have been when I was watching movies on TV and consuming them avidly as a sort of, film fan around the age of 10 and upwards. And it would have been, I can't remember the order in which I saw them now, but it would have been the classic Private Eye movies. So it would, The Big Sleep, Murder My Sweet, the Maltese Falcon. I've listed them in order of memory. It turns out I just listed them chronologically backwards. Then I would have been getting interested in Hitchcock around this time. So I would probably see Notorious, which I would place within the noir cycle. I know it's one of those perhaps, where there's a discussion to be had around it. I would have seen Touch of Evil. I think that would be when Orson Welles died. There was a big well
Oh, in
season
85,
on
right.
BBC2. Yeah. So I'm certain that's the first time I saw Touch of Evil, which a lot of people see as the end point, a symbolic end point, if not actual end point of the noir cycle. I think, although subsequently my research has focused predominantly on Britain, although at that time I don't know that I was as much a fan of British cinema. I love films, of course, like The Third Man, which I would say is a British noir, although that term wasn't really used at the time, but retrospectively it's
I'm
been
with you.
claimed. Yeah. And Odd Man Out and those sorts of films. So I'd seen those, but I wasn't as familiar with British cinema, I think, until I got to university. I think that's when my future research
Now,
career was set.
yeah.
Studying at UEA, which of course in those days was a real centre for British cinema teaching and research.
Was Charles Barr already there when you were there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Charles Barr was there, Andrew Higson, Thomas L. Sasser was sort of there, but he never taught me, and I think he was on secondment somewhere else for a year. So, but it was Tom. He had an office there. At least he was around. Peter
Right.
Kramer,
Oh, of course,
and so
Peter.
on.
Yes.
I met you there, Sergio.
Well, I was going to say, yes. I mean, I wasn't going to fess up to that immediately. I couldn't quite remember if we were in, because I was there as a master's student.
it was the film studies seminar room with all the equipment in on the
Yeah.
third floor and
Yes,
so
yes.
on. Yeah, we had most of the seminars. Yes, and
So that was a while ago. That was
Mike
not.
Allen was there at the same
Oh,
time. Who was
Mike. Yeah, with all the
so,
Blu-ray. No, the
the,
Laserdisc
the,
machines.
the Laserdisc. Yeah.
I was
So
so
yeah, it was a
impressed by
great time.
those.
Studying film. Yeah.
Did you ever get into Laserdiscs? I did.
We used them at UEA, and often it was Mike who came in and set them up for us. You see, I'm digressing here, but when again going back a few years, I think it was Christmas 1980 that we got our first video recorder,
Ah.
which my dad was a film fan like me. It was a JVC front loading, which went clunk 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 as he put the cassette
Yes.
in.
Now I remember.
It was quite expensive in those days. I mean,
Yeah.
the prices came down pretty quickly, but a 3 hour blank tape cost £9.27. I don't know why, but I can't remember the exact amount. From a store called Cole Brothers, the John Lewis in Sheffield. My dad would buy one or two at a time. We had certain rules about what we would keep for posterity, for repeat viewing, and so on. So James Bond movies we kept.
I was going to ask.
Law
Right.
movies we kept, and big films as the big blockbusters used to come on TV, the Superman and Raiders of the Lost Ark. We would keep those, but a lot of other stuff. It was a case of the tapes we need to reuse at that kind of price. And by the time I was in employment and could feasibly have thought about it, the Laserdisc thing was over.
It was DVDs. Yeah.
I was quite a late convert to DVDs actually, because it was that thing, the backward compatibility. So I've got
Yeah.
boxes now of VHS tapes and so on. I still hung on to it because there are some things that are that aren't on DVD and aren't on streaming. In fact, the program we're going to speak about today, Casino Royale, I mean, yes, there are copies on YouTube, but in terms of a legal and authorized home media release in the UK, it's still the VHS releases from the 1990s. I think there's a DVD release for the United States. Bizarrely, in this age of plenty, this age of abundance, when we think everything is there for streaming, it isn't always, or at least not in as I say, it's on YouTube, but not in great quality.
And it's a real fallacy as well, because I think there's a whole generation of young people who are interested in cinema who are A, convinced that it's all available, and B, that it's going to be there permanently. And one of the things we've discovered is that even large companies like Disney and Warner Brothers are purging their streaming services because it's expensive to keep everything on there. So even new stuff gets pulled off. And if that never came out on any kind of physical media, then you can't actually get it. So even something like, the TV spin-off from the George Lucas film Willow was an early casualty. It was the one season of it only a few years ago, wasn't particularly popular. They've taken it off. It's just not there. It's not on Disney Plus anymore. I mean, it's not to say it might not turn up somewhere else, possibly. But if you need it to, no, I want to show, I remember seeing this and I want to show it to the classroom and I want to discuss it, how are you supposed to do that? And one of the great things about VHS was, of course, how linear it was and how easy it was to just record something and create a clip or make a copy. You just had to get a SCART lead and plug two machines together and you had a compilation. And none of us seemed to mind the fact that the quality wasn't that fantastic because it was adequate.
It did the job. And when early in the VHS era, when the alternative for doing historical research in film was making a trip to the BFI to sit on a steam deck and watch it that way, with all the expense of the travel that's entailed, particularly for somebody traveling from outside of London and so on. Then VHS was great. You sacrifice that quality aspect. The quality was perfectly adequate. There was never pristine, but it was adequate, and it was good enough. I think what DVD and Blu-ray have brought out is sometimes in such a perverse way. I mean, with the James Bond movie, with the Blu-rays and with the 4K, the detail that you now see is actually not the detail you were supposed to see when the films were released. So we are instead watching them in enhanced quality now. And sometimes these films have been restored and put out on DVD or Blu-ray, and the fan culture isn't interested in them. They're too pristine in that condition.
It's a bit like, the Grindhouse movie, I suppose, that was deliberately sort of scratched up and made to look like a 70s or an ersatz 1970s double bill, although nobody went to see that. I think the logic being somehow they got a bit confused. Says, hang on, what? It was a bit too niche. I love the fact that there's something very telling about some Blu-ray releases that, of course, are being packaged in facsimile VHS containers. Have you seen those? It's quite funny. You open it up, it's got a Blu-ray inside.
Yes, yeah.
And it's always for 80s films. It's sort of Trading Places or something. Something we all remember watching. I was recently having a chat with a guy who's seems to be a bit younger than us, James, but he's a scholar of hard-boiled literature and has written a novel and has a fantastic podcast called Mean Streets, which is about film noir. And we were having a conversation, and because I mentioned to him that we were going to be talking about Casino Royale, which has multiple screen iterations, and he had no idea that there was this TV version from the 1950s. He'd never heard of it. As you say, it's not easy to buy singly here, and it's not even an extra. Let's call it. It would be an interesting extra, wouldn't it, on one of the Blu-ray or now 4K ultra high definition releases, and they clearly own it. I assume it's owned by the MGM combine that now is, but I don't know if there's other issues involved. A lot of people tend to talk about things being in the public domain, and in fact, I think that's something you mention in your book, but because of the underlying rights, it can't be.
I'm fairly certain it's not. It was CBS that dramatized it. This version of Casino Royale is the, let's call it the forgotten James Bond. It's not very well known outside of Bond fandom, and even within Bond fandom, it doesn't have a particularly good reputation. For a long time, it was the lost James Bond because, of course, this is a live drama, October 1954, broadcast just the once, and it was the year before Ampex came into US TV. It turned out that a film print, a 16mm telecine transfer, turned up in the 1980s, and this was one of those classic stories. It was discovered by a film collector going through a skip outside CBS Studios, supposedly. It was thrown out with some offcuts and so on. It was retrieved in that way. Now, it was not, as far as I'm aware, recorded for posterity in the way that some early TV dramas were. A telekine would have been made. It must have just been one of those that was recorded for training purposes. And it is interesting that sort of makes sense, because when you look at the surviving prints of it that we have, I did work out that it does have a lower average shot length and a faster cutting ratio than most TV dramas did at the time. It
Right.
starts off quite slow actually,
Mm.
but it gathers pace throughout. And when we come into the card sequence, there's a lot of short shots, close-ups, and cutting backwards and forwards. Now, what is interesting and is a cautionary tale for us all here is that, as I said, this version of Casino Royale has a very poor reputation amongst most Bond fans, and it's often written about as if it's called cheap and creaking and so on. It's true that the version we have, because of the nature of the telecine, it is a bit blurred around the edges, and sometimes it goes in and out of focus occasionally. Now that's just the technical quality of the transfer. When it was shown in 1954, it would have looked better. Stories persist about how shoddy it was. Now, in fact, it was actually the series it was part of, Climax, which was one of these weekly anthology drama series, had a budget. I looked it up just before we started the recording. $52,000 per 1 hour episode, which was notably above average for live studio drama in 1954. So it was certainly not a cheap and cheerful production. One of the stories that persists and that people love to tell was that Peter Lorre, who plays Le Chiffre, the villain. I mean, this has a very good cast, and we'll no doubt come on to that. But the story persists that after Bond has shot Le Chiffre, Peter Lorre falls down dead and then can be seen on camera getting up off the floor and walking off to his dressing room. That story is in numerous accounts that occur in the fan literature. It's one of those myths. It does not happen in any version of of the drama we have, but the story still persists, and so people are writing about it without having seen it. That's a cautionary tale, I think about this. It's certainly when I was able to finally see it. As I say, it came out on home video in the UK in the mid 1990s, and when I saw it, I was knocked out by it. I thought it was very well done technically. I thought it was an excellent adaptation. It's different from the Bond films. It is not a technical, sumptuously dressed, lavishly produced. Of course, it's not that. It's a live studio drama, but very well done and surprisingly close to Ian Fleming's book.
Well, so let's backtrack just a little bit. Ian Fleming in 1952 is, legend tells us, and so did he, is about to get married, and he's a bit tense about it. And he's having what appears to have been an annual holiday, and he bought a home in Jamaica called Goldeneye, and he seems to have had, what, 4 to 6 weeks holiday every year or in one cluster. So obviously he had a very good job. And he decided he would write this book. Now, before we even talk about the book, I suspect, from my reading of it, is that the influences on Fleming are quite interesting. But it seems to me that, and I don't know what you think about this, but it seems to me that the success of people like Mickey Spillane and James Hadley Chase was crucial to the way he ended up developing this novel, this kind of pacey, exciting, sexy, violent novel with kind of specific, commercially exploitable moments within the narrative that fall within a certain category of particularly big paperback success in America. Chase was a British writer who set his books in America, but who apparently never went there, so he used slang dictionaries. Whereas Mickey Spillane, aka Frank Morrison, obviously was an American and wrote these incredibly violent revenge fantasies that were hugely popular and that were derived from a kind of comic book character that he'd originally developed in the 40s called Mike Danger. And there is a kind of comic strip feel to the Mike Hammer stories that he puts together, but they were hugely popular. Do you think they were an influence on Fleming? I mean, it seems to me they were. At least the commercial success of them were. But I can't prove it.
Well, yeah, I can perhaps elaborate a bit upon that. Traditionally, I think, as certainly in Britain, cultural and literary historians, we tend to see Ian Fleming's James Bond as a kind of peak or climax of that historic lineage of British gentleman, adventurer, heroes that goes back to John Buchan, to Sapper and Bulldog Drummond, those kind of two-fisted, upstanding defenders of the British Empire. And there certainly is a legacy of empire influence that comes through in Fleming's Bond works. And Bond has some of the trappings of those earlier heroes. Bulldog Drummond drove a Bentley and was fond of a martini. Famously fought against an arch villain, Carl Peterson, who headed up a sort of global syndicate. And so this is Bond into the later adventures, goes up against Blofeld and Spectre, the special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion. So that tends to be the lineage in which we see, in which we place Bond. Fleming, quite interestingly, I mean, we know that Fleming read the Bulldog Drummond stories when he was at school. And they must have been an influence to some extent, particularly the fast-paced and rather implausible plots. But when asked about it, Fleming said that, well, really, he wasn't basing Bond on Bulldog Drummond because he felt those were archetypes of an earlier era that really, after the Second World War, ceased to have any cultural or ideological resonance. And in the case of Bulldog Drummond, the popular view of it now is that it's a fascist hero. There are certainly in the Black Gang, there's certainly strong anti-Semitic elements to it. So Fleming was distancing himself from that. But what he said was, he said the people I admired were Dashiell Hammett's and Raymond Chandler's characters. He spoke about those two in particular as being rooted in some kind of plausible reality. And here I think it's important when we think about Casino Royale. We tend to think about the Bond stories as being these sensational, highly melodramatic, colourful, hugely improbable adventures, sort of people planning to rob Fort Knox and hold the world to ransom with stolen nuclear weapons, all these sorts of, running poison suicide gardens in medieval Japanese castles. This is not the subject of social realism. But when we go back to Casino Royale, what we get is actually a pretty plausible spy story. The sensational elements are not in it yet. It's rooted in contemporary geopolitics. It's a sort of story that you could sort of believe. The nature of the mission to discredit a communist agent by outbidding him at cards and discrediting him in the eyes of his paymasters. And also the Casino Royale has a rather bitter ending. It's somewhat downbeat at the end. The girl, the heroine, turns out to be a traitor, and Bond feels betrayed and so on. And there's a degree of ambiguity Casino Royale. It's the kind of ambiguity that we get perhaps with Raymond Chandler, or that we get with British writers like Graham Greene and Eric Ambler. A lot of the contemporary reviews of Casino Royale did some sort as a kind of John Buchan, but others did to mention Eric Ambler. Now, of course, from Live and Let Die, which is the second novel onwards, the books do become more melodramatic and more sensational. But the very first one, I think, is different and has that plausibility, I think, that we expect of a good spy story. I mean, I think that here there's the connection between spy fiction and detective fiction, and both can sit within noir, I think, broadly defined. Is that in my view, I think the best examples of them are where there is that veneer of plausibility. In Fleming, it's in the details. Bond, we know what kind of what he has for breakfast. We know what kind of gin and what kind of vodka he prefers his martinis. We know what kind of personal weapon he has. Bond doesn't just pull out a pistol. He pulls out a Beretta 25. It's not the Walther PPK, not at the start of the books. And Fleming has that ability to those sorts of details bring plausibility, so we can accept the perhaps slightly improbable conspiracy plots because we have the details of Bond's daily life and routine and what he eats for breakfast and where he buys his cigarettes.
Yeah, I think for me, the reason I was thinking about Spillane as a potential influence was partly because of the last line of Casino Royale, if you like, and the bitch is dead, which is a bit similar to the Eye of the Jury last line, where the femme fatale, he shot her, And she says, "How could you?" And he answers, "It was easy." It's that sort of slightly ridiculous, hard-boiled, super exaggerated. I don't know, how interested you think he was in creating something that would be commercially successful. Was that important to Fleming, do you think?
In public, he used to say, "Oh, the James Bond books, they're this my fantasy. They're not meant to be taken seriously. I write for warm-blooded heterosexuals in railway trains, airplanes, and beds." And so he was writing, genre fiction for a certain kind of reader. However, in private, in his private correspondence, his wife, Anne Charteris, was part of the literati set with people like Evelyn Waugh and Somerset Maugham, who were very disparaging about Fleming's work. And I think he was a little bit put back by that. And I think I think he would have liked to have been taken a little bit more seriously. But then if asked about it publicly, he would disavow it because he didn't want to be seen
Right.
as that kind of writer. He was sort of commercially minded from a very early stage. The Bond books are copyrighted to a company for exploitation. He's very parsimonious with his signature. He knows Fleming was a major book collector, a very important collector of first editions, and he knew the value of a first edition. The first edition of Casino Royale was under 5,000 copies in the UK. It wasn't a huge print run. What happened with the Bonds is that the early books got quite good reviews, particularly from the Times Editor supplement, Spectator, the kind of middle brow, Times and Telegraph, and that was enough to get them into paperback. And because he's writing a book a year, the first paperback appears in 1955, and then the Bonds go from being these sort of hardbacks for a certain kind of probably middle class readership to going mass market. In 1957, there's a serialization deal with the Daily Express for Much of His Love. You mentioned the influence of comic strips, or there's a James Bond comic strip drawn by John McCluskey that starts at the same time. And so by the late 50s, the sales are really taking off. You can see between 1958 and 1962 is the peak for the growth in the sales of Fleming's books. And that's important because the sales are increasing significantly before Broccoli and Saltzman produced the first Bond film, Dr. No, in 1962. One thing, while I remember this, Sergio, is that it's very interesting to compare the UK and US paperback imagery and the covers, because the British editions tend to be very stylized. They're often emphasizing the kind of elegance of Bond's worlds. They'll use the motifs like the playing cards and so on. Whereas when Casino Royale was published in the United States, it was published not as Casino Royale, but as you asked for it. And it has a real noir cover. Bond is in the background, wearing a lumberjack shirt and with his sleeves rolled up. And in the foreground is this voluptuous, seductive femme fatale. And it's almost as if the American paperback was positioning it within that pulp fiction tradition. When Penguin Books published, I think it would have been the 50th anniversary, 2003. Again, the UK editions had either sort of stylized black and white imagery of casinos. The American covers are beautiful works of art. They're retro pulp. It's all pouting women and sensationalism and lurid colors and details and so on. Really beautiful sort of retro pulp covers. And I think there's that sense that in America, Bond has perhaps been positioned more within that hard-boiled tradition. And that, I think, is a different cultural position than Bond occupies in Britain. And it's where this version of Casino Royale sits. This is an American TV production. Notoriously, in the eyes of some fans, it Americanizes James Bond, played by Barry Nelson. But I think there's a conscious positioning of Bond within an existing tradition of American popular fiction.
Live from Television City in Hollywood, Barry Nelson. Peter Lorre. Linda Christian. Starring in tonight's production of Climax, a great new hour-long dramatic series from Hollywood.
So when it was used for the Climax anthology series, which was a new series, so this was simply that they just bought the rights to do a one-off TV show, is that right? Basically it was a title, they read it, thought, yeah, we'll option it, and they did a script and to turn it into a 1 hour live drama. So obviously there are certain constraints. Since in essence live drama is like a stage play, so although you're going to get ad breaks, you can't have an ellipsis of any kind. It's all happening right in front of you unless you feed in a little bit of pre-recorded film or something like that, which I think at the time they didn't do very often. I think that was difficult because you had to roll it in live again, so you had to run off a film print or what have you, because like you're saying, no videotape yet that they could really use in the studio. Or do you think it was because it's set in a casino primarily that it's a good fit, because a lot of it is in a very small number of locations?
Climax was with an exclamation mark. It's Climax with an exclamation mark. It was produced by CBS. It's one of these weekly anthology dramas which adapts a different story every week. And with Climax, it was doing specifically mystery, detective, and thriller stories. It started out with I haven't seen this one. I believe it does survive, but the very first Climax episode was an adaptation of The Long Goodbye.
Oh, with Dick Powell,
Who, of course, had played Marlowe in Murder My Sweet.
oh, I'd love to see that. Yeah.
Film. Like casting you're playing Marlowe again for TV. So that was the first one. The second one was I think a pre First World War mystery play, and Casino Royale was the third adaptation. I don't think that CBS attached any particular significance to it. There was a standard contract deal for the author, $1,000 for the rights. $1,000 was a lot more then than it is now, but it wasn't. That wasn't big time money, and that would have been a one-off deal. If Fleming would have got any. Well, it was never repeated, obviously.
So no royalties, no nothing. Yeah.
So I don't think that there's anything of particular significance attached to the property, but it did make the novel does make for relatively easy adaptation to the studio. There are no film excerpts in it. No, the opening is an exterior outside the casino building. It's the front doors, but it clearly is in a studio. We have some special effects bullet marks going off against a pillar as Bond as an assassination attempt on Bond. He dodges behind it, but yeah, it does lend itself to that sort of interior, very claustrophobic, close, tight camera positions. The one thing that's different between live studio drama and seeing a play, of course, is we can still cut into the space. So the director's using, I'm not sure how many actually. I think it's 3, maybe 4, different camera setups, so we can cut backwards and forwards. Done very effectively in Casino Royale. In the card sequences, we're cutting backwards and forwards between close-ups of Bond and close-ups of Lachief, and then side shots of the table and of the other players. So yeah, it lent itself, I think, very readily to this form of television. So there's a clear technological determinant there. It's interesting that the host, because it has an on-camera host who introduces Casino Royale, William Lundigan, and describes it as based on the bestseller by Ian Fleming. Well, Casino Royale in 1954 was not a bestseller, certainly not in the United States, and not really in the United Kingdom. The Bonds did achieve that status later on. So he eggs up the popularity of the book. It's always interesting to speculate. What might have been. As film and TV historians, we know what films are made. We sometimes it's interesting to speculate about which were not made. And Fleming was, from a fairly early stage, was trying to interest film producers. Alexander Korda read the proofs of Live and Let Die, and by all accounts thought it was a rattling good yarn, but not really something you could make into a film. The Rank organisation optioned Moonraker for a while. Moonraker is a very filmic kind of novel in a lot of ways. So Fleming was looking to develop that, but he was also negotiating with US TV companies. And there were a couple of initiatives, one in 1957, another around about 1958, where he's involved in writing, not scripts as such, but at least scenario ideas and treatments for half-hour, spy adventure series. Fleming being Fleming, when the series doesn't happen, he recycles them, and that's how we get the James Bond short story collection in For Your Eyes Only. So I think he was interested in the adaptation potential, and TV might have been a possible avenue for that. I've come across no evidence that CBS ever thought of this adaptation of Casino Royale as what would today be called a backdoor pilot. That they were testing it as potential. No evidence of that whatsoever. But it is the kind of material that would have fitted. There's a Dick Tracy TV show. Dragnet, of course, is there. A little bit later, moving on to film, you got the Untouchables and the FBI. So the subject matter would have fitted it, but I don't think it would have been James Bond, the British spy, as we're used to in the films. I think it would have been more James Bond, the American spy or secret agent or detective.
Oh, you're a legend, old boy. Cod Sense Jimmy Bond, they call you. I knew you right away.
Let's address the Americanness, because that's obviously for some fans, obviously, you mentioned it earlier, a bit of a stumbling block in terms of sort of connecting with this particular version. So in this adaptation, it's Barry Nelson, American actor, and he's not playing James Bond, he's playing Jimmy Bond. So it's not a massive difference.
Well, I'm going to contradict that one.
Go!
Bond fans, on the whole, tend not to be particularly keen on the casting of the American Barry Nelson as Bond in this adaptation. Now, of course, today there's this association of Bond and Britishness. Bond is a big British cultural and economic export. There's an association between Bond and British cultural life. We only need to look back to the famously the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympic Games, James Bond starring in a film with Her Majesty the Queen. So there's that associated. Bond was there with the Spice Girls and Isambard Kingdom Brunel and the Industrial Revolution and the Beatles as brand Britain. It's something that's recognised for its Britishness. In 1954, that wasn't the case. In 1954, hardly anyone had heard of James Bond. Casino Royale had got good reviews, but modest sales initially. It was not, the bestseller at that point. And also, really bear in mind, this is an American drama. It was never seen in Britain. It's a live drama that's been broadcast in the US for audiences, again, most of whom will not have read this. So I see it as perfectly natural that Bond is Americanized. And let me just throw in, but let's not forget that Raymond Chandler was once relocated to London for that rather awful 1970s version of The Big Sleep that we don't want to talk about
If you want to come on the show and discuss that, I can't get anybody else to do it.
It just does not work. And that's, it just shows how much the city and the location is so important to Chandler. So it's been done back to the Americans. So I'll let them off the hook of that. It's also said that Barry Nelson plays Jimmy Bond in the adaptation. Now, he is referred to as Jimmy by other characters. So Leiter, who here becomes British, Clarence Leiter refers to him. Oh, you're a legend, old boy. Card Sense Jimmy Bond, they call you. And Valerie, who's the version of Vesper in the adaptation, is his former girlfriend on this occasion, a change to Fleming's plot, calls him Jimmy. But when he answers the phone, he answers it as James Bond. When he's introduced to the concierge at the casino, he's called James Bond, and so on. So the Jimmy is again, it's another one of these slight fan myths. It's other characters refer to him by that name, but he never uses it himself.
So Jimmy to his friends.
Yes, I guess to his ex-girlfriend and Clarence Leiter of the British Secret Service, who replaces Felix Leiter of the CIA. That reversal. I think ideologically is quite interesting. I mean, one of the readings of Fleming's books that's put forward by Kingsley Amis, for example, Bond exhibits this fantasy world in which the British Empire still exists and Britain occupies a position of leadership, of geopolitical global leadership. And the United States, while the military and economic power of the United States is certainly acknowledged, plays a secondary role. Felix Leiter is the secondary, which is a complete reversal of the actual Anglo-American power dynamic, after the end of the Second World War. So the fact that in the TV version, it then goes back to Bond being American and the sidekick becoming British, I find quite fascinating. That's almost a more accurate, reflection of geopolitical reality in the 1950s than what we have in Fleming.
I always remember that it's part of the prologue, the cold open for You Only Live Twice, where you get that scene when you've got sort of the Soviets on one side and the Americans on the other arguing about who's just caused the spaceship to get gobbled up. And you get the Brits saying, we don't agree. We think that it went down in the Sea of Japan. And so it's all coming from them. And then we cut to Sean Connery as Bond, and then, the film can actually begin. And I always thought that was just sort of classic. I mean, it's Robin Bailey, who is kind of a wonderful kind of, sort of aristocratic Brit. And the fact that in 1967 you could still sort of do that in this film is both comforting and amusing and I think thoroughly entertaining.
The Bond films do have a changing and rather adaptable relationship with national identities. So there are some of the films where you have the Honor Majesty's Secret Service, motifs of nation, of the monarch, the title sequence, Union Jack being pressed through a martini glass and an hourglass and so on, becomes very symbolic. Skyfall reflects, I think, in a number of other interesting ways on the idea of the decline of Britain, but also the strength of Britain. That Britain might not be a global superpower in the way that the United States and China are. It's still not an insignificant player in global affairs. I think Skyfall nuances that quite well. So we have a mix between those sorts of films and then films like Diamonds Are Forever or The Spy Who Loved Me, where Bond's nationality is parodied and sent up. Famously at the end of The Spy Who Loved Me, Bond is caught in flagrante with Roger Moore and Barbara Bach in the life capsule, and M and the Minister of Defence and General Gogol looking through the window. Bond, what do you think you're doing? Keeping the British end up, sir. And so it's mocked. So the patriotism is mocked. Against the Roger Moore era, and both of them were. I think one of the reasons the films have endured is that flexibility. They've judged the moment when to do a serious engagement with Britishness, but they've also known when Britishness can safely, or that that very patriotic imperialistic idea of Britishness can safely be parodied.
Well, and certainly The Spy Who Loved Me is the one that very successfully, as you say, has it both ways. Because one of the things that it does right at the beginning, of course, at the end of the amazing stunt off Mount Asgard, is that, of course, he has the Union Jack parachute. And I think audiences always respond very positively to that. Apparently there was cheering at the time. And as you say, and then you get this kind of slight put down joke right at the close of the film. So I think, as you say, they're very smart.
I can attest to that personally. Yeah, I mean, Spy Who Loved Me was the first. It wasn't the first Bond film I saw because I'd seen some of the Sean Connery films on television, but it was the first film I ever saw in the cinema.
Me too. Yeah.
My dad told me, and yeah, there was applause, and it's that moment of British pluck and ingenuity and daring, and so on. He's encapsulated in that moment. And of course, The Spy Who Loved Me came out in the Queen's Silver Jubilee year. Yeah. So there's an interesting. It says here, Casino Royale, the novel, is published published a few weeks before the coronation. Actually, before Elizabeth II's coronation, and then you have this association. So Spy is the Silver Jubilee film, and Skyfall is the Golden Jubilee film.
Well, in fact, one of the comments you make at the end of your the third edition of your book, License to Thrill, is to point out that whatever James Bond there is next, of course, it'll be the first one made in which we don't have the Queen.
Be on His Majesty's Secret Service, and whether that will bring about a significant ideological, realignment, because the association between Bond and the monarchy, both in Fleming, but also in that marvelous, Olympic film that was done, is very strong. That's something that needs to be, that I hope will be addressed, and I hope will be addressed in a thoughtful and imaginative, but above all entertaining way whenever we get the next film.
In your book, you very nicely put down some of the attitudes and myths about the TV version of Casino Royale. And you mentioned earlier that whole business with Peter Lorre, who is playing Le Chiffre, who was played by Orson Welles in the 1967 version and Mads Mikkelsen in the 2006 version. And this whole business about him apparently going down and getting back up again. So, of course, he gets up again because, in the words of the Princess Bride, he's not completely dead. As I recall. But can you expand on that just a little bit to explain?
Yeah, well,
also to explain his role in it.
There are a couple of so what happened was the very first print that was rediscovered of Casino Royale was missing the last 2 minutes or so. So without, I'll try to avoid spoilers for listeners who've not seen it, but basically they've restaged the torture sequence, not the way it's in the book, but the villains they're after the check. So Bond's tied up in the bathtub, and Peter Lorre's been pulling his toenails out with a pair of pliers. One of the villains, while searching the room, thoughtfully leaves a razor blade close to the bathtub, so Bond is able, with Val's assistance, to cut the rope to escape. He shoots one of the heavies, and he shoots Le Chiffre, and Le Chiffre falls out. Now, in the first version that was recovered, that's where it ended. Then, from another source, a slightly more complete print was found where Le Chiffre is wounded. Okay, he's been wounded, but he still does not get up off the floor and walk off to his dressing room. What he does is he gets to his feet, he gets hold of another razor blade, and he's using it to threaten Valerie. And there's a shot. There's a shot of Valerie, played by Linda Christian. There's a shot of him holding it, sort of just above her breasts, and it's a really threatening image. And then she just manages to pull away from him enough, and then Bond does shoot him, and he falls down quite definitively. And then Bond collapses in a chair, and she's comforting him, and that appears to be the end. So yeah, I mean, Peter Lorre does get up again, but it's a bit more like Jason or Freddy Krueger or somebody coming back for that final. But just when you think you've knocked off the serial killer, they always get up again and come back for that final confrontation. Maybe Casino Royale, the TV Casino Royale, invented that convention.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
So how do you think, not the TV adaptation, but if we're say we're comparing Le Chiffres, as it were, or whatever the plural of Le Chiffre would be, the Nothings, how well do you think the Peter Lorre version compares with the Orson Welles version and the Mads Mikkelsen version? Obviously, the Welles one is, I find it very hard to judge. I've tried so many times to really love it and really engage with it, and I tend to find interesting bits and I get exhausted by it. But how do you think they reflect on each other as adaptations, as the three adaptations of the book?
Good evening, Mr. Bond. I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine, Sir James Bond, Herr Ziffer.
I've always heard of you as Le Chiffre.
Well, that's the same. You see, it's a nickname of mine. After the war, I was a displaced person, just a number on a passport. Le Chiffre means a mere cipher. Seemed a suitable name.
May I say you're a very important cipher?
You flatter me, sir. We play tonight, huh? Good luck.
Thanks. To you.
Valerie?
One of the strengths of of the 1954 Casino Royale is it has a very good cast. Barry Nelson was best known as a Broadway actor, and it has a bit of a Hollywood glamour with Linda Christian, who I don't want to be unfair, but can we describe her as maybe a second division,
I think that's fair.
starlet of the 40s, early 50s, but has brings that Hollywood glamour to at a time when television was still seen as being the inferior medium. But the masterstroke is the casting of Peter Lorre, who is perfect. He's Fleming's villain. He's Fleming's Le Chiffre. Fleming's villains were always grotesque in some kind of way. And they were either quite short or they were very large and very big. And Le Chiffre is supposed to be quite short, although broad in bulk. And Lorre, at this stage of his career, because it's a time when his bulk has expanded, he is perfectly, because he's also quite short, he's perfectly cast. He's the ideal casting, I think, of any period as the villain of that book. And a scene in the third act of Casino Royale, where the first act is the plot and the business and the character relationships. The second act is the card game, which Bond wins, and that pretty much they play as they do in the novel. And then the third act is Le Chiffre and the villains coming to Bond's hotel room and trying to retrieve the check and torturing him. And there's a scene where Bond's been bundled into the bathtub. Lorre is giving him the lecture on, we don't really want to hurt you, and just tell us where it is, and you'll avoid all this unnecessary pain and so on. And the camera is shooting from Bond's eye level upwards, and Laurie's bulk is dominating in the frame. He comes across as a really sinister. I mean, okay, this is Peter Lorre. He was a brilliant villain actor, but he comes across as the incarnation of Fleming's character, and I think it really captures it in a way that the later versions didn't. I have a certain soft spot for the 1967 Casino Royale. I never quite enjoy it as much as I want to, because I always want to go back and find it to be a unrecognised piece of brilliance. My way of thinking about it not as a James Bond film, but as one of those 1960s crazy all-star comedies. So, those Magnificent Men in their Flying Machine and The Great Race and A Funny Thing Happened Under the Form. Those kind of zany anything goes comedies. Now, all that said, and Sergio, you mentioned earlier the other Bond film in 1967, You Only Live Twice, part of the Eon Films series, of course. All that said, there is more original Ian Fleming content in the spoof Casino Royale than there's the whole of the film of You Only Live Twice. Because they do at least maintain the character names, even if they're sent up. And there's a scene where Orson Welles as Le Chiffre there's a carpet beater hanging on the wall behind him.
Yeah.
They're clearly casting Orson Welles for cameo star value, I suppose we would say with Orson.
Casino Royale is too much for one James Bond. Orson Welles is the heaviest heavy of Smirch. Dahlia Lavey is James Bond.
I'm the new secret weapon.
Terence Cooper is James Bond. Barbara Boucher is James Bond. Casino Royale is indestructibly wild.
Hello, sailor.
We know famously the animosity between Wells and Peter Sellers, so they would turn up on different days to do their reaction shots at the studio. But Wells turns Le Chiffre into a magician. He turns him into Orson Welles. He's producing pigeons and does out of his hands and doing all the magic tricks and so on. And so Le Chiffre, doesn't come across particularly well in that film, but it was being rewritten every day. Val Guest's sort of argument is very good on this. He said Charlie Feldman, the producer, would phone him up each evening and say, "So-and-so's passing through town tomorrow. We write them into the picture." And so that's why it's this crazy, I suppose we now call it postmodern pastiche. What I did find when I was researching the third edition of License to Thrill, where I'd access for the first time to some of the script treatments, is that actually there are a couple of treatments of later films, The Spy Who Loved Me, where Blofeld is in the early treatments of The Spy Who Loved Me, and he's described as looking like Orson Welles.
Who wrote that treatment? Yeah.
Yeah, that was Richard Maybaum. That was Richard Maybaum's treatment. Okay. And the idea was that this is the old Spectre, and they're having one of their regular board meetings. It says Blofeld in wheelchair, large man with beard, looks like O. Wells. And then the new faction break in, assassinate the old board, and Blofeld is so mostly dumped out of a window in his wheelchair. And this new radical Spectre faction take over. Now, of course, none of this is in the film. That was all John Christopher Wood brings in Stromberg. But the legacy of Orson Welles, having played even in a non-Eon film, I don't like the term unofficial James Bond films. I mean, Casino Royale was an official Bond movie. It was produced by Charlie Feldman, had the rights to that story. It's using the title, it's using the character names. It might not be a very good James Bond film, but it is certainly an official James Bond. And then with Mads Mikkelsen, he's a very good heavy villain actor.
I hope our little game isn't causing you to perspire.
It doesn't bother you killing those people?
Well, I wouldn't be very good at my job if it did.
For me, Le Chiffre doesn't quite work in the film. Maybe it's not really the actor's fault. I think the problem with the 2006 Martin Campbell directed version of Casino Royale, it's actually the same problem as we have in the book. Le Chiffre tortures Bond, then Le Chiffre's paymasters turn up, kill Le Chiffre, leave Bond because they're not in order to kill him, and so on. And so Bond is denied, and the audience is denied the satisfaction of killing the villain who's tortured him. Now, in the 54 TV adaptation, that doesn't happen. Le Chiffre is the main villain. He gets his comeuppance at Bond's hands at the end. So we do get that sense of satisfaction, but we don't get that in the Daniel Craig film. And I think that's I think it's a little bit top heavy with villains. We have Mr. White and Sebastian Foucon's character, the free runner. Great sequence that is, but
wonderful sequence.
There are few too many villains in the film and ultimately I think Mads Mikkelsen isn't really able to do anything much with the character. It doesn't have, by this time in the Bond movies, we are used to the villains being there for excess. So having the big speeches about world domination, having the lairs. Le Chiffre doesn't have any of that, and yes, that's authentic to the book. But for the films, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say maybe the film of Casino Royale, which I do like a great deal, but maybe it was a little bit too faithful to some of the book, because what he did is the middle part of the film is the book updated to the present, of course, and then they bolt on big action sequences before and after, which we expect of a Bond movie. One thing the film does change, again, it's interesting compared to the TV version. They're still playing baccarat in the high stakes card game, and there's a scene where Bond has to take Clarence Leiter aside and explain to him the rules. In the novel of Casino Royale, there's a whole chapter where Bond explains the rules to Vesper. I'm sure the reason they would have changed that to poker in the film is that it's rather dull exposition to have somebody explaining the rules of a card game, whereas you kind of get says most people, we all think we know the rules of poker. And there are different variations in different versions of it, but basically, we kind of get it. We kind of know what we're looking for. So you don't need to have that exposition. There's a little bit in the film with Mathis, but not. You don't need the long sequence where you're explaining what is a winning hand.
Of course, the problem with baccarat is that it's not really a skill game. It's just a version of 21. At least with poker and Texas Hold'em version, at least you can bluff and you can show some skill at reading the other players. Whereas with baccarat, you're just completely at the mercy of whatever's come in front of you because you're playing against the dealer. You're not playing against the other.
It's maths. Can you what are your chances of holding on sticky on 17?
Yeah. So in a movie that's hard to make that really fun, I think. So they weren't wrong there. I know what you mean though about the structure. As you say, I think it's the structure of the book. They've waited so long to film it. I guess that they've decided to be close to it. The only reason why I think it sort of works in the Craig film to the extent that it does, because yes, it always felt a little bit long, and the Venice sequence is wonderfully made, but it does feel like the film was kind of over anyway. And okay, more greatness, but it's kind of I'm already there, is because you're setting up a sequel, which of course they'd never really done before. Before you had oh, say the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Blofeld gets away and in theory gets killed off at the very beginning of the next film. As continuity, that would have worked if Lazenby had continued to play the role. It doesn't in this context, and besides, he comes back again anyway, so it doesn't matter. Here, by having one of the too many villains, at least that means that because you're going to continue with that villain into the next film and into Spectre as well, ultimately, in terms of Mr. White, that sort of makes it okay. You're not wrong, James. But in my head, I kind of think, okay, I can see what they were going for, so I see why they did it.
There is a parallel to the books, because, of course, at the end of Casino, when after all the revelation of Vesper being a double agent and so on, but then Mathis tells Bond about Smirch, and Bond said, "Well, I'll dedicate my life to destroying Smirch. I've got." He has this kind of ideological rebirth, having had doubt in himself and so on. So, and I guess you get that in the film with it's pointing way forwards to the organisation behind Le Chiffre, which we then take forward into Quantum of Solace. The noir connection, I guess, with the 2006 Casino Royale is the pre-title sequence, which was very different from most of the previous films, which had often had a quite elaborate stunt, mini action sequence often, and this was very much more low key, shot in black and white, flashback and flash forward with the two killings and the intercutting between them. You've got the noirish mood of it, but you've also got the non-linear narrative. It's Bond doing Martin Campbell doing a little bit of Casino Royale, just at the start as a kind of art movie, anyway. Not to the excesses of No Time to Die, but I did like that beginning. Because we don't need always to have a really spectacular stunt to start off a Bond movie, because sometimes they're the best part of the movie. You get the climax at the beginning. The Spy Who Loved Me is great. I love it. It is one of possibly my favourite Bond film. I'm not saying it's the best. I'll say it's my favourite Bond film. 5 or 6 minutes in is as good as it gets.
Yes, it's the most memorable part of the whole film, and I think what's smart about the way they begin Casino Royale, as I say, is because I remember I sort of cheered inside when we got the payoff at the end of the black and white sequence when he turns around and shoots the guy, and it's the point of view, through the gun.
It's the Hitchcock moment. It's the spellbound moment where we get the red. The blood.
But also, of course, it makes that opening, Maurice Binder bit of graphic actually work diegetically for the first time ever. And I think it's terrific. And then, of course, we immediately cut to a gigantic chase sequence. So we got a chase sequence, just to wait just a little bit longer. And then and of course, why that works so well is that it sets up the contrast between the incredibly athletic free running and the kind of bull in a china shop approach. I love that bit when he sort of, the free runner just flies through this tiny little hole.
The little window pane.
And the guy Bond just goes right through it.
Into the plastic ball.
I thought that was splendid. So with that in mind, trying to prognosticate is never easy. In your terrific book, I hope you do a 4th edition. You've done 3 now of License to Thrill. You end your 3rd edition of the book, which you finished writing in 2022. Is that right?
Yes, I submitted it in 2022, yeah.
Well, you give it a date, so I'm quoting you. There you sort of look a little bit ahead and, you do some fairly good crystal ball gazing, it seems to me, about what's likely to happen. Given the information we now have about the Broccolis having seemingly basically sold their interest to a large extent to MGM stroke Amazon, and having now they've got themselves a director, but it's a director who's going to be busy making another movie for the next 18 months, so it's going to be ages. And they've got Steve Knight, who we know from films like Eastern Promises and Peaky Blinders on television as the writer. We'll see how long he's on it. What do you prognosticate for the future? Go on, commit yourself.
Yeah, Dennis Villeneuve had been spoken about before. He was possibly in the running at an early stage for No Time to Die. I don't think we're going to go back to having fun Roger Moore type Bond. I have very mixed views about the Amazon takeover. I'm not wholly negative about it, as some are, but I do have some reservations. By the 2020s, the Bond films, the production setup was an anomaly. It was a legacy of Cubby Booker and Harry Saltzman. They were bespoke blockbusters. There isn't really there isn't another franchise, as we now like to call them all. They used to be called film series, but they're franchises now. There isn't another one where you've had that level of creative agency residing with the producers over such a long period. And the producers really calling the shots. For a long time, United Artists were very happy with what Bockley and Saltzman and then Bockley were doing. We know that more recently with Barbara and Michael, they always used to say every new film that came around, they were having to negotiate with the new MGM management because the studio management teams turn around so frequently and so on. And so there's more studio pressure and the Sony leaks, WikiLeaks over the discussions over the Spectre script are very revealing in that regard about how there's pressure from the distributor and pressure from the studio to do certain things, and the suggestions they're making indicate they've got no idea what James Bond is or should be, or the legacy of the series. So I think maybe Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson had a long time pushing back against that, and then with the Amazon had bought out the MGM, that there was we're going to have to go through all this again, and so they eventually gave up the rights. There's a lot of speculation that Amazon, at the time, the deal went through, that Amazon wanted to get this property and stream it. It's all going to be on Amazon Prime in the future. I see it in the world. Wait, I think Amazon's already got that market. I think Amazon is wanting to get into a new market, and that's the first release theatrical market. And Bond is still the ideal property for that. Yes, they'll go to, the films will follow up on streaming and home media, but I think it's still that theatrical, the prestige of that theatrical release is what they're looking for. There's certainly going to be money behind it, so I wouldn't have any concern about the production values. I hope it goes on putting the budget on the screen, as Cubby Bockley used to say. We don't need all these inflated salaries for bit part actors playing M or the villain of the day necessarily. Fear is, look what Disney did to Star Wars. So we had the theatrical films, the continuity theatrical films, then we had the spin-off feature films, then we had the TV series, and so now, some of the TV series get very good notices, some of them less so. So they've been a mixed bag. But I think the view with the theatrical films is they started pretty well with The Force Awakens and declined. Are we going to get that saturation of content, or the saturation? People invoke the Marvel films. I hope not, and my gut feeling is that we won't. And I hope that Amazon are going to have the sense to realize that Bond is a product. It's a big, marketable franchise product where you want a reasonably stable production. Really, it used to be at 2-year intervals. From 65 through to 89. And then for most of the Pierce Brosnan era, they were at 2-year intervals. The last Brosnan was 3 years, but most of the time, they were 2 years, and that was enough to have anticipation about the new film, to give it a nice build-up. It's not like the Marvel films where you've got yet another one coming out next week or whatever, and you don't have any breathing space in between. You could have reissues, as they used to have. The film goes to TV, and then you build up towards the next film. So my hope is they will continue with that for the theatrical releases. One of the things that concerns fans is, but are we going to have more TV content? Are we going to have the Moneypenny spin-off? Are we going to have Young M, Bond's brothers, Lanny's adventures with Marshall Tito, or whatever? Are we going to be saturated with Bond spin-offs? Maybe, but you don't have to watch them. My hope is that if I were the studio head and if I were doing it, I would follow two trajectories. I would do films every 2 or 3 years, production values, megalomaniac villains, car chasers, beautiful women, exotic locations, real stunts as far as that can be done. And Tom Cruise in the Mission Impossible films, we don't have to CGI everything to do those. But I would combine it, if I were calling shots, with a TV series, or maybe not a series, but a series of TV specials, series of 2-hour TV movies, starting with Casino Royale and filming each of the Fleming stories in chronological sequence and set in period, in the way that ITV did with Agatha Christie's Poirot, in the way that Granada did with the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes series. Go back and film Fleming stories in period, as reasonably close to the stories. You have to change some things, but as reasonably close as you can to the stories, and that can be bonded in an entirely different universe and different continuity. I don't think it would affect the commercial value of the films. My guess is we won't see it, but it's what I hope we might see.
So if the next film comes out, let's say 2028 or 2029 at this rate, will you do a new edition of your book and add it in there? That's what I want to know.
Well, the problem with writing books on James Bond films is the book is up to date for about 6 months. The publisher always wants it to get it out to coincide with a new film, but by definition, you can't include the new film at the time of submitting the manuscript. So I was quite fortunate with the third edition that we've got this hiatus. So the third edition remains completely up to date until the next film is released. So in my interest, the longer that takes, the better. As a Bond fan, of course, I want to see the new film as. I don't want them to rush it. I hope they don't wait till 2029. I think that the second edition license to film was adding in 3 films from the previous one. And this time around, there's another 4 films. But also, I rewrote a lot of this time because I had access to new archive materials, and my take on the films has not substantially changed. There's some nuances and things, but I've got more archive knowledge now, and I felt it was important to bring that to the table. It does expose some of the myths, some of the things that I'd assumed just because I'd read it so many times. There's a treatment of Dr. No where Dr. No was a monkey. And you read it so many times, it becomes received wisdom. Well, I've read that treatment now. Dr. No has a pet monkey, but Dr. No is not a monkey. Yeah.
Richard Maybaum had a thing about monkeys and gorillas, didn't he? They come up
and he
a
had
lot.
a thing about lasers.
Laser,
it's almost like listening to Dr. Evil. A laser. He's got all these, for golfing. He's got all these magazine articles on laser, laser. So I think it'll be a long time before I do a 4th edition because to depend upon the goodwill of fans and supposed to buy it all over again. I need enough new films to make it worthwhile. So I don't think adding in just one new film. So there need to be maybe another 4 or 5 films before I could reasonably add new material of any substance.
Now that you've written a whole book just on Dr. No, surely there's at least another 24 or 25 films that could get the same treatment.
Well, I'll give a plug to my other half, Luella, who's been in the BFI Classic on From Russia with Love. So that the first two James Bond films have had the Chapman treatment. I'd pass on writing a book on No Time to Die, that's for sure. I think Skyfall, it got a very positive response at the time. And now that we've got a little bit of distance from it, I do think the way in which it taps into, sort of cultural and ideological contexts in Britain at that point, it was so much more successful at the box office than the films either side of it. That there's therefore something, it's not just the regular Bond audience.
What are you currently working on?
I've got a book coming out on called Comics at the Movies, which is a history of comics-driven comic book film adaptations from the Flash Gordon serials up to the Marvel and DC franchises. It's quite a broad stroke work. I have a book on British popular cinema in the works that will look at post-war, roughly between 1945 and the end of the 1970s. Looking at cycles of films where we can document that these were the top films at the box office, and after that, I'm going back to Hitchcock on Hitchcock and theatre, looking at the films that Hitchcock made that were based on stage plays, which are predominantly early British films, and then wrote down in Vermeer and I Confess from the American period.
My last question. You mentioned going to see Spy Who Loved Me as a lad. which is what I did. I went to see it at the Odeon in Maidenhead and got taken there by my mum, and I enjoyed it. I think I'd probably seen something about it on Clapperboard, I suspect, with Chris Kelly. But I don't know if I would consider it my favourite. And I'm not even sure it's the first Bond film I saw at the cinema, because I have a feeling that earlier than that, I'd been taken to see From Russia with Love in Italian in Rome. And I would have seen that with my dad. So I'm not sure. But is Bio Love Me really your favourite, sentimental favourite?
It is, but also because I think of all the Bonds that do the more humorous, and which are not only Roger Moore films, of course. I would say Diamonds Are Forever was the first Roger Moore James Bond film. It just had Sean Connery in it, but in the the spoofy, setting it all up and so on. And similarly, License to Kill was the first Daniel Craig James Bond film. It just didn't have Daniel Craig in it. It had Timothy Dalton instead, but So the story about Spy was that we were at the Odeon at St. Peter Port in Guernsey, and we were on holiday. My mum and dad, and my dad's brother and his family. And the idea was, we thought it'd be a nice idea to have an outing to a cinema. Bio Love Me was on. It was a big, I remember it being a very big, 2,000 seat cinema. It might have been the only cinema in Guernsey, but it was a big and well appointed one. And so we went there as a family group. And evening show. And before we went, we were in the guest house, and my dad sat me down. I said, right, we're going to go see the James Bond film. Oh, great, because I've seen these on TV. So, yeah, I don't remember seeing Doctor No when it was first on, but I've certainly seen From Russia with Love and Goldfinger on TV. And he said, but there's one thing I just got to warn you about. It's not the same James Bond that you've seen on TV. And I thought, I don't know, I might not like this. But I had, at that time, gone through the trauma of John Pertwee becoming Tom Baker in Doctor Who. Yeah. I was mortified when I heard that John Pertwee was leaving. I just got into Doctor Who in his last season. 10 minutes into the first episode of Robot, I mean, who was John Pertwee? Oh, this new guy's great. And I'm thinking, okay, I know it's not Sean Connery, and it did get me. I like the bit where they General Gogol sends a message to Triple X in the pre-title sequence, and we've got the man and the woman in bed, and the man looks a bit like James Bond, and you think he's going to answer the thing, and she answers it. Oh, that's clear, So I was all of 9 years old. I was noticing this cinematic virtuosity. But then then we get Roger, we get the ski chase, we get the Union Jack, and after that, Roger Moore is my James Bond. He's my cinema James Bond, and I just love that film. I do feel of all Roger Moore ones, it's the one that got the balance between the spectacle, the action, good action sequences. Yes, the few jokes in them, but they're also very well staged and very well done, as we discussed. The romance, and Roger does have his little serious moments. When there's the reference to his wife, and so just that. He doesn't need much more than that, but I think that works pretty well. And so on, and we're seeing the new ones coming out in the cinema. Then I started to realise, Spy is the first time in the films when it's not Fleming, okay, and it's later, Diamonds and The Man with the Gun have pretty much lost contact with Fleming, but there's still at least the title and a few character names in there. Spy is the first one where there's no Fleming content, and basically it's a James Bond greatest hits collection. So you've got a car chase, you've got a ski chase, you've got an underwater battle, you've got a big pitch battle at the end. It's the best bits from all. You got a fight in a train compartment. It's the best bits from all the previous films put together and carried off with a degree of panache. And as films go, I'd say From Russia with Love is a far superior spy thriller. I'd say that Goldfinger is probably a more culturally impactful James Bond movie. I think that Skyfall is a better made Bond movie. But Spy, if I was taking one Bond film to Desert Island, or even one film to Desert, that just might be.
It's impossible to choose, I find. I think from a Desert Island point of view, if I only had the one, I'd rather not go to the Desert Island, really. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is kind of an important one. It's anomalous. It's special.
I love Majesty's. It's the closest to the book. I think Diana Rigg's excellent, and that's nothing to do with my crush on her, but I think Diana Rigg is excellent casting. Lazenby is perfectly good. He's perfectly adequate.
Yeah.
And he's very good. People say if Connery had done Majesties, it would have been the ultimate James Bond movie. I think Connery was. I agree, he was bored with it by the late 60s, and I don't think Connery could have pulled off the scene at the ice rink. Lazenby pulls it off because there's a line in the book. There's a line where it says Bond was exhausted. He was finished. He was at the end of his tether, and there was no stuffing left in him. He couldn't have another fight. He was gone. And then the girl turns up and rescues him. And Lazenby, because he's not such a great actor, actually conveys that vulnerability. He's scared. He's scared by the guy in the polar bear suit. And I think that comes off so well. The ski chase is superbly staged and edited. The final attack is very well done, and they keep the ending. They keep the tragic ending. I think that's what harmed the box office rather than Lazenby. And the box office was it was down.
It was okay anyway,
but it was still the most successful film in Britain of the year and one of the top 10 films worldwide. It was not a failure. It more than recouped its costs. So the patriotic motif, I think, plays well, questions Bond's relationship to the monarchy and his commitment to the nation and the service and so on. Ultimately upholds it, of course, because it's a James Bond film. But yes, you've got a few introspective moments. You've got some nice M and Moneypenny moments in it. It is an excellent Bond film. I've seen the treatments for what would have been the George Lazenby diamonds, and it's Bond and Draco on a revenge mission after Blofeld. That's what it is.
That would have been great.
It's only a treatment that it never gets to a full script. But yet Goldfinger's twin brother is in it, but he's not the main villain. He's not the main villain. He turns out to be semi. And not, he's a bit more like someone like Columbo. He's a subsidiary villain who's working for Blofeld, and then Blofeld bumps him off when he kind of turns and helps Bond out. So it's a direction that the Bonds did not take in the end, and I understand the reasons why. We nearly got another American James Bond in Diamonds Are Forever, of course, with John Gavin.
Oh, John Gavin, that would have been bizarre. I mean, in a way, it tells you a lot, doesn't it? And Guy Hamilton's saying that he really wanted Burt Reynolds. Now, Burt Reynolds, good actor. The kind of Burt Reynolds good old boy persona wasn't really there yet, so there's a bit more logic to it.
It's pre-Smoking the Bandit, so
Yeah.
But I think Reynolds would have played Bond as an American. I think John Gavin would have attempted to play him as British. There's a transcript of a telephone conversation between Broccoli, Saltzman, and United Artists, and it's UA as saying, we'd kind of prefer Burt Reynolds over Roger Moore. Harry Saltzman says, we want Burt Reynolds. And Cubby says, over my dead body are we having Burt Reynolds. It's Cubby holds out for Roger.
For a British actor, yeah.
I don't have a problem if you cast... Look, Bond's been played by an Australian actor. He's been played by an Irish actor. I don't care if you cast an American. I don't care if I don't care if you cast a non-white actor. The actor needs to play Bond as British. I don't think we can go back to Barry Nelson playing him as American now. And I don't think today that Bond has to be white. We tend to assume that Bond is white. Fleming writes him as white, but there's also Fleming is always describing Bond in terms of other him. But Bond looks out of place. He seems alien and un-English. There's something different. His cruel looks. Was he in Live and Let Die? There was the mixed blood of the Americas in Bond's dark hair, and so you could cast a non-white actor and still be, if not literally true to Fleming, but I think it's a way of expressing a sense of otherness within a British identity. I kind of don't think they'll go there with the casting, but we'll see. But it's if you get the right actor, I don't think it matters.
I kind of hope it isn't Tom Holland. I mean, just because there's these rumors, and just because he seems so young.
My last contribution on speculation about whoever gets the role, I think, is somebody where there are no odds on them at the moment. I don't think any of the actors who are being discussed at the moment, some of them are just being invented by the media. certainly because people got a film out to sell and so on. I don't think of it. Daniel Craig was a really left field choice. He turned out to be a successful choice. I've got reservations about the last film, but I think it'll be someone who's not in the frame right now.
Well, on that screen bombshell, James, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about the forgotten James Bond Casino Royale from 1954, the television adaptation, and to talk about Bond in general. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sergio. It's been a pleasure too.
And, we could do this again in about 10 years' time when the next one comes out. You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.